The ballroom went silent so fast I could hear the ice crack inside someone's whiskey glass. My sister stood frozen beside her wedding cake, her bouquet trembling in her hands, while her future father-in-law stared at me with the smug confidence of a man who had spent his entire life humiliating people in public and never once been challenged for it. "You can put medals on a woman," he said loudly, lifting his champagne glass toward the crowd, "but that doesn't make her respectable." A few nervous laughs scattered across the room. Then he looked directly at me. At some point, he continued, "A woman has to admit she failed at building a real family." My sister's face drained of color. My father lowered his eyes, and I slowly stood up in my army dress uniform after 23 years of military service, and asked the one question that made the old man nearly collapse in front of 400 guests. "Mr. Whitmore," I said calmly, "do you have any idea what you did in Fallujah?" The smile disappeared from his face instantly. His fingers loosened around the champagne glass. "What?" he whispered. For the first time all evening, the room belonged to me, and 10 minutes later people would understand why. But to explain that night, I have to take you back to the day my mother died. I was 19 years old when my father walked out on us. Not disappeared. Not vanished. He walked out carefully, deliberately, like a man leaving a restaurant after paying the check. He packed his leather suitcase on a Thursday afternoon, while my mother stood in the kitchen gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. My little sister Emma was only 9 then. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor coloring a horse in a dollar store coloring book, while our father calmly told my mother he deserved happiness. I still remember the smell of burnt coffee in the kitchen. I remember the sound of ice dropping into his glass while my mother cried quietly. And I remember the exact moment I stopped being a daughter. Because someone had to become the adult in that house. The woman my father left us for was 28 years old. Blonde, perfect teeth, worked in real estate. He met her at a charity golf event and apparently decided 2 daughters and a sick wife no longer fit the image he wanted for the second half of his life. 3 weeks later, he moved into a lakefront house with her outside Charlotte. 3 months later, he stopped answering Emma's calls. My mother never recovered from it emotionally. She tried to pretend she did. She still made Emma pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse on Saturdays, still folded laundry while humming old Fleetwood Mac songs under her breath, still smiled when neighbors asked how she was doing. But grief has weight, and eventually it crushes people slowly enough that nobody notices until they can barely stand anymore. 2 years later, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Stage 4. I was 21 when the doctor explained treatment options using words that sounded strangely clinical compared to the horror sitting in that room. Aggressive progression, limited response rates, palliative care. Emma cried immediately. My mother apologized. That was the kind of woman she was, dying in front of her children and somehow still worried about inconveniencing us. My father came to the hospital exactly once. He wore an expensive gray coat and checked his phone 3 times while the oncologist spoke. When he left, he kissed my mother on the forehead like a businessman leaving a networking event. Emma waited 2 weeks for him to come back. He never did. The night my mother died, rain hit the hospital windows so hard it sounded like gravel. Emma fell asleep with her head in my lap while machines beeped softly around us. I remember brushing her hair away from her face and realizing how small she still looked. How young. Too young to lose everyone. My mother looked at me during her final hour with eyes already fading around the edges. "Promise me," she whispered. I knew what she meant before she said it. "Don't let her feel abandoned." I nodded because I couldn't speak. And after she was gone, after the nurses shut off the machines and Emma screamed into my shoulder so hard her body shook, I stood in that hospital hallway and made a decision that changed the entire course of my life. I joined the Army 3 months later. Not because I dreamed about medals or patriotism or adventure. I joined because military housing came with stability. Because healthcare mattered. Because Emma needed school supplies and winter boots and someone who wouldn't disappear when things got hard. I became a logistics officer first, then intelligence support, then overseas coordination. My 20s disappeared inside military bases, deployment schedules, early morning briefings, and long nights staring at government laptops under fluorescent lights. But every month money went into Emma's account. Every birthday gifts arrived. Every school play, every dance recital, every heartbreak after some idiot teenage boy made her cry. I was there somehow, even if it was through a shaky video call from another continent. When Emma got pneumonia at 13, I spent 11 hours arguing with a commanding officer until I secured emergency leave. When she had nightmares after Mom died, I stayed awake talking to her until sunrise despite having field training at dawn. And when she graduated high school, she searched the crowd for me before she searched for anyone else. That nearly broke me, because by then she didn't look at me like a sister anymore. She looked at me like home. People love talking about sacrifice like it's noble and cinematic. They picture dramatic music and waving flags. Real sacrifice is quieter than that. It's eating cold takeout alone in military housing, because your little sister needed braces more than you needed furniture. It's pretending holidays don't hurt. It's sitting in your car outside elementary schools after parent-teacher meetings because you're 26 years old and suddenly responsible for raising a child who isn't yours. There were nights I cried from exhaustion after Emma fell asleep during our calls. Nights I wondered what my life might have looked like if I'd chosen myself instead. Marriage. Children. A house somewhere peaceful. But every time those thoughts surfaced, guilt crushed them immediately. Because Emma never asked for any of this. None of it was her fault. By the time I turned 42, I had reached the rank of lieutenant colonel. Emma had become a second-grade teacher in Savannah, Georgia. She rented a little white cottage with blue shutters and grew herbs on the porch because our mother used to love gardening. She still called me every Sunday evening, still asked if I was eating enough, still said goodnight the exact same way she had when she was 9 years old. Love you bigger than the sky. And every single time I answered the same way. Always bigger. I truly believed the hardest part of our lives was behind us. I had no idea that the man who would eventually try humiliating me at my sister's wedding had already entered our lives. And when he did, everything began to change. Emma met Daniel Whitmore on a rainy Thursday afternoon because a little boy in her class swallowed a quarter. That was the story she told me later while laughing into the phone like a teenager trying not to sound too excited. The child's mother panicked, the school nurse overreacted, and Daniel, who happened to volunteer one afternoon a month at the pediatric clinic nearby, came over to help calm everyone down. He was kind, Emma told me softly. Not fake kind, real kind. I was sitting alone in temporary housing outside Fort Bragg at the time, eating microwaved soup from a paper bowl while rain tapped against the windows. I could hear something in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Hope. Not the desperate kind people force onto themselves after heartbreak. Something quieter, safer. What's he do, I asked. He's a cardiologist. I said. So he's rich. Emma laughed. That's your first question. No, I replied. My first question is whether he treats you well. The second question is whether he's rich enough to afford therapy after meeting our family. She laughed so hard she snorted. That was Emma. Even at 32, she still snorted when she laughed too hard. Over the next few months, Daniel slowly became part of our lives through stories first. Tiny details. The way he always carried extra granola bars in his car because he worried Emma forgot to eat lunch during school days. The way he fixed her leaking kitchen faucet without making a big show of it. The way he sat with her elderly neighbor for 2 hours after the woman's husband died. He sounded steady, grounded. And after everything Emma had lived through, steady mattered more to me than charming ever could. The first time I met him in person was during Thanksgiving at Emma's cottage. I arrived late because my flight had been delayed in Atlanta. By the time I pulled into the driveway, warm, yellow light glowed through the windows, while jazz music drifted faintly from inside the house. When Daniel opened the front door, he looked exactly like the kind of man older women in grocery stores trust immediately. Tall, dark hair touched with early gray at the temples, calm eyes, clean sweater, no arrogance in his posture. But what mattered most was the way he looked at Emma, like she was something fragile he intended to protect carefully. Not own, protect. That distinction matters more than most people realize. You must be Claire, he said warmly, offering his hand. I've heard terrifying things about you. I hope so, I answered. Emma appeared behind him wearing one of Mom's old aprons, flour dusted across her cheek, and for a moment something inside my chest loosened. Because she looked happy, truly happy. Dinner that night felt almost normal, the kind of normal people take for granted until life teaches them how rare it actually is. Emma kept refilling everyone's wine glasses. Daniel helped carry dishes without being asked. We told embarrassing childhood stories while rain hammered softly outside. Then Daniel mentioned his father, and the entire mood shifted in ways subtle enough that Emma probably didn't notice. My parents are hosting Christmas this year, he said carefully. You should come. Emma smiled nervously. Your father still thinks I'm too liberal. Daniel gave an exhausted little laugh. My father thinks everyone is too liberal. Politics, I asked. Controlled, Daniel replied quietly. That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. A few weeks later, I met Richard Whitmore for the first time. The man owned 3 private equity firms, sat on multiple charity boards, and carried himself with the polished confidence of someone who had spent decades believing money made him wiser than other people. His house outside Charleston looked less like a home and more like a resort designed by someone desperate to impress strangers. Marble floors, massive chandeliers, paintings nobody actually enjoyed but everyone pretended to admire. Emma squeezed my arm before we entered. Please, she whispered, just survive dinner. I survived Kandahar, I muttered. How bad can rich people be? I learned the answer 20 minutes later. Richard Whitmore shook my hand without warmth and immediately noticed my posture. You're military, he said. Not a question. Yes, sir. His eyes moved over me, slowly assessing, judging. You still active duty at your age? At my age, I repeated. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. I suppose some people have trouble adjusting to civilian life. Emma shifted uncomfortably beside me. Daniel immediately stepped in. Claire's a lieutenant colonel. Impressive, Richard said flatly, though his tone suggested the opposite. Though I always find it unfortunate when women sacrifice personal lives for careers. I stared at him calmly. And I find it unfortunate when men confuse money with wisdom, I answered. A dangerous flicker crossed his face. Daniel nearly choked on his drink. Emma kicked me lightly under the table. The conversation moved on after that, but the temperature in the room never recovered. Over the following months, Richard's disdain became impossible to ignore. He disguised insults as observations. You never married. Must be difficult spending holidays alone. I imagine military culture hardens women emotionally. Sometimes he said these things privately, sometimes in front of others. The strange part wasn't his cruelty. It was the way he watched me afterward. Like he was studying whether I recognized him. At first I thought I imagined it. But then came the rehearsal dinner. Emma had chosen a small waterfront restaurant overlooking Charleston Harbor. Candlelight reflected across the water, while soft piano music drifted through the room. Everyone seemed relaxed for once, until a waiter accidentally bumped my shoulder and knocked open the edge of my dress uniform jacket. Richard saw the insignia stitched beneath it, specifically the old unit patch I rarely wore anymore. His face changed instantly. Not anger, fear. Tiny, fleeting, but unmistakable. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly I noticed even from across the table. You all right, Dad? Daniel asked. Richard grabbed his wine glass too quickly. Fine. But he wasn't fine. For the next hour, he barely spoke. Twice, I caught him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. And just once I saw something I never expected from a man like Richard Whitmore. Panic. Late that night, after Emma fell asleep in the hotel suite beside me, I sat alone on the balcony overlooking the harbor while humid wind rolled off the water. I kept replaying his expression in my head. Where had he seen that patch before? Why did it affect him so deeply? I almost convinced myself I was overthinking it. Until the next morning. I was walking through the hotel lobby when I heard Richard Whitmore arguing quietly with someone on the phone near the elevators. I told you that file was buried, he hissed. A pause. No, listen to me carefully. If anyone reopens Fallujah, we all have a problem. Every instinct military service had sharpened inside me came alive instantly. He turned suddenly and froze when he saw me standing there. For 3 full seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he forced a smile. Couldn't sleep? He asked casually. I smiled back. Not when something feels wrong. And for the first time since meeting him, Richard Whitmore looked genuinely afraid of me. By the morning of the wedding, Charleston smelled like saltwater magnolia blossoms and money. The ceremony was being held at an old estate overlooking the harbor, one of those sprawling southern properties with white columns, manicured gardens, and enough imported flowers to feed a small country. Staff members moved around silently in black uniforms, while violin music floated through the open courtyard. Everything looked perfect. That's the dangerous thing about wealthy families. They know how to decorate pain beautifully. I stood alone in the bridal suite, adjusting the cuffs of my dress uniform, while Emma sat in front of a mirror surrounded by makeup brushes and champagne glasses. She looked breathtaking. Not because of the dress, though it was elegant enough to belong in a magazine. Not because of the professionally curled hair or the diamond earrings Daniel gave her the night before. She looked breathtaking because she was happy. Nervous, yes, emotional, but happy in the purest way. For a few minutes I simply watched her silently. The little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms was getting married. "You're staring," she said softly through the mirror. "I'm trying to figure out when you stopped being 9. Emma smiled sadly. "Probably around the same time you stopped being 19. That hit harder than she intended. She turned in the chair and reached for my hand. "You know, you didn't have to give me your whole life, right?" I looked away immediately. Because if I met her eyes too long, I might cry. And I had spent too many years teaching myself not to. "You were never a burden," I said quietly. "I know, that's what makes it worse." Before I could answer, the suite door opened. My father walked in. For a second, nobody moved. It had been almost 6 years since I'd seen him in person. Age had softened him physically, but not spiritually. His hair had gone silver around the sides, and his expensive tan looked slightly artificial beneath the indoor lighting. Behind him stood his new wife, Melissa, the same woman he abandoned our mother for decades earlier. She wore pearls. My mother died wearing a hospital bracelet. Funny how the mind remembers details like that. "Emma," my father said warmly, arms opening as if he belonged there. "Look at you." Emma stood slowly, uncertain. Part of her still wanted a father, even after everything. That's the tragedy of abandonment. Children continue loving people who do not deserve it. He hugged her carefully while Melissa dabbed fake tears from the corners of her eyes. Then he looked at me. "Claire." "That's still my name," I replied. An uncomfortable silence followed. Melissa immediately stepped in with forced brightness. "This is such a beautiful day. We should focus on healing." Healing. I almost laughed. People who destroy families always become obsessed with healing once consequences embarrass them publicly. But Emma looked overwhelmed already, so I swallowed every bitter thing rising in my throat. For her. Always for her. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel cried the moment Emma walked down the aisle. Actual tears. No embarrassment about it either. That mattered to me more than he probably realized. And when he looked at her during the vows, I believed he loved her honestly, which made what happened later even more painful. The reception began just after sunset. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the ballroom while servers carried trays of champagne through clusters of laughing guests. A jazz band played softly near the dance floor. Politicians, surgeons, investors, and socialites filled the room wearing expressions polished carefully over decades of expensive living. I stayed mostly near the edges of the room. Military service teaches you how to observe quietly. And from the edges, you notice everything. The way Richard Whitmore drank faster every time our eyes met. The way he kept whispering to 2 men I didn't recognize. The way my father avoided standing near me entirely. At one point, Emma found me beside the terrace doors. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded. "You sure?" "No," I admitted. That made her smile a little. "Thank you for being here anyway." I touched her cheek gently. There's nowhere else I'd be. Then Richard Whitmore tapped his champagne glass with a spoon. The room slowly quieted. Here it comes, I thought. Rich men love microphones almost as much as they love themselves. Richard stood near the center of the ballroom in an expensive tuxedo, smiling with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling every room he entered. To family, he began smoothly. Guests lifted glasses. To legacy, to tradition, to building lives worth admiring. Polite applause followed. Then his eyes landed on me, and something cold entered his expression. Of course, he continued, not everyone understands what family truly means. Emma stiffened beside Daniel instantly. Richard kept smiling. Some people mistake sacrifice for virtue when really... He shrugged lightly. They simply failed at building lives of their own. A few uncomfortable chuckles scattered through the crowd. Daniel frowned. Dad. But Richard ignored him. I mean, let's be honest. Hiding behind medals and uniforms may impress strangers, but eventually a woman has to ask herself why she ended up alone. The room went completely still. Emma whispered, "Oh my God." Richard raised his glass slightly toward me. A real legacy, he said, is marriage, children, stability, not becoming a middle-aged soldier nobody comes home to. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward me. And then came the worst part. My father said nothing. Not one word. He stood there holding a whiskey glass while another man humiliated the daughter who spent half her life raising his child. That silence hurt more than the insult itself. Emma's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Stop," she whispered to Richard. But he was enjoying himself now. Men like him always do. "You know," he added casually, "I almost feel sorry for women who convince themselves independence is strength. Usually it's just loneliness wearing expensive camouflage. I slowly set my champagne glass down. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Then I stood. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Calm. That's what unsettled people most. 23 years in the army teaches you how to control your emotions long after everyone else loses theirs. Richard watched me approach with smug satisfaction, certain he had already won. I stopped directly in front of him, close enough to see sweat gathering near his collar despite the air conditioning, close enough to notice his hand trembling slightly around the stem of his glass. Then I asked quietly, "Mr. Whitmore, do you have any idea what you did in Fallujah?" His entire body froze. The color vanished from his face instantly. "What?" he whispered. The ballroom fell silent, and for the first time all night, Richard Whitmore looked terrified. For a moment, nobody in the ballroom moved. The jazz band had stopped playing sometime during Richard's speech, though I don't think anyone remembered exactly when. Glasses remained frozen halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-breath. Even the waitstaff stood motionless near the walls, sensing instinctively that something dangerous had entered the room. Richard Whitmore stared at me like a man who had just seen a ghost wearing his own face. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words came out too quickly, too rehearsed. I had spent most of my adult life around people trained to lie under pressure. Politicians, contractors, intelligence officers, men dragged into interrogation rooms trying desperately to keep secrets buried beneath confidence. Fear always sounds the same eventually, and Richard Whitmore was terrified. I tilted my head slightly. "Really?" Daniel stepped forward, immediately confused and alarmed. "Claire, what's going on?" I looked at him carefully before answering. "Your father and I have crossed paths before. He just doesn't know it." "That's absurd," Richard snapped, suddenly recovering enough arrogance to raise his voice again. "I've never met you before in my life." "Not personally," I replied calmly. "But I've spent 7 years reading reports connected to your name." Now people were whispering openly. I saw Melissa gripping my father's arm. I saw Emma shaking beside Daniel, trying desperately to understand how her wedding had become a battlefield. Part of me hated myself for this moment, but another part remembered body bags, smoke, blood, and a 19-year-old soldier crying for his father after shrapnel tore through his lungs. Some truths arrive late because they need witnesses. Richard forced out a brittle laugh. "This is unbelievable. You're ruining your sister's wedding because you can't tolerate criticism." "No," I said softly. "I'm ruining your evening because you mistook my silence for weakness." That shut him up. I reached into the inside pocket of my dress uniform slowly. The movement alone made him pale further. Then I removed a folded document. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just paper. Funny how paper frightens powerful men more than weapons sometimes. 20 years ago, I said clearly during the Second Battle of Fallujah, a private military supplier delivered defective armored transport components to Marine support units operating west of the city. A few older veterans in the crowd straightened immediately. They recognized the name. Fallujah. Richard swallowed hard. I continued. 3 convoys experienced catastrophic equipment failures over a period of 8 days. One vehicle lost side panel reinforcement after an IED blast that should not have penetrated the armor. Daniel looked between us, completely lost now. "What does this have to do with my father?" I met his eyes. "Everything." The room had become so quiet I could hear silverware clinking faintly in the distant kitchen. 7 soldiers died, I said. 11 more suffered permanent injuries. Internal investigations blamed battlefield conditions initially. I paused. But battlefield conditions weren't the real problem. Richard suddenly stepped forward. "This conversation is over." "No," I replied. "It's finally beginning." His breathing had changed now, shorter, uneven. That's when I knew for certain. Guilty men remember details innocent men forget. I unfolded the document carefully. Whitmore Strategic Logistics held subcontract authority over reinforcement materials used in those vehicles. Daniel frowned immediately. "Dad." Richard looked furious now, but beneath the anger lived panic. "Government contracts involve hundreds of people," he barked. "You can't throw around accusations because of some ancient military report." "Ancient?" I asked quietly. Interesting word choice. Emma moved toward me slowly. "Claire, what is this?" I looked at my little sister. And suddenly I saw her at 9 years old again, standing in a hospital hallway after Mom died, clutching my hand because she was afraid everyone she loved would eventually leave her too. I hated that she had to hear any of this tonight. But lies had already poisoned too many lives. 3 years ago, I said softly to Emma, a federal review reopened procurement records connected to Fallujah after new whistleblower testimony surfaced. Richard whispered something under his breath. A prayer, maybe? Or a curse? The review uncovered falsified durability certifications. I looked directly at him. Documents signed under companies linked to your father-in-law. Daniel's face lost all color. No, he said immediately. No, my dad would never. Daniel, Richard interrupted sharply. Too sharply. That was the mistake. Because everyone heard it. Everyone heard the fear. I stepped closer to Richard until only a few feet separated us. Do you remember Staff Sergeant Michael Torres? I asked quietly. His eyes widened. There it is, I thought. Recognition. His convoy was hit November 17th, I continued. He survived the explosion initially. Then the side reinforcement failed during extraction. Richard looked physically ill now. He burned alive inside the vehicle while 2 Marines tried to pull him out. Emma covered her mouth. Several guests looked horrified. And suddenly the ballroom no longer resembled a wedding reception. It resembled judgment. I didn't know, Richard whispered weakly. That almost made me angry enough to lose control. Almost. You knew enough to bury reports, I said coldly. You knew enough to pressure inspectors. You knew enough to move money through shell suppliers after the investigation began. That's not true. Then why did federal prosecutors reopen the case? Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. I slowly handed him the folded document. His hand shook visibly as he took it. Daniel stared at the page over his shoulder. Then I watched the exact moment his son stopped seeing Richard Whitmore as untouchable. What is this? Daniel whispered. Richard didn't answer. So I did. A federal summons. The room erupted into whispers instantly. Richard's face collapsed inward somehow. 20 years of polished confidence cracked all at once, revealing something weak and desperate underneath. You investigated me? He asked hoarsely. No, I replied. I investigated why American soldiers died inside vehicles that were supposed to protect them. I leaned closer. And eventually your name kept appearing. Melissa began crying quietly near the back of the room. My father still said nothing. Cowardice ages badly. You can always recognize it in old men. Richard looked at me with naked hatred now. You waited until my son's wedding. I stared at him for several long seconds before answering. No, I said softly. You humiliated yourself at your son's wedding. I simply stopped protecting you. That landed harder than anything else. Because it was true. If he had left me alone tonight, I would have stayed silent for Emma's sake. But men like Richard mistake restraint for surrender. And eventually they push the wrong person too far. Daniel stepped backward slowly away from his father. Tell me she's lying. Richard opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No words came out. And in that moment his son got his answer. I looked down at the summons still trembling in Richard's hand. They'll be expecting you Monday morning, I said quietly. Then I stepped back. And Richard Whitmore, millionaire socialite patriarch, looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, while finally realizing there was never any ground beneath him at all. The wedding did not end with music. It ended with the sound of chairs scraping backward, guests whispering into phones, and Richard Whitmore standing under a crystal chandelier with a federal summons trembling in his hand. For a few minutes, nobody seemed to know what to do with themselves. Wealthy people are usually excellent at pretending nothing is wrong, but some truths are too large to hide beneath polite smiles and imported champagne. Daniel was the first to move. He turned away from his father and walked straight to Emma. She stood near the wedding cake, pale and shaking one hand pressed against her stomach as if she might be sick. Her veil had slipped slightly from her hair. Mascara darkened the corners of her eyes. She looked less like a bride then, and more like the little girl I used to find curled on the hallway floor after nightmares. Daniel reached for her but stopped inches away. He did not assume he had the right to touch her. That mattered. Emma, he said, his voice broken. I didn't know. She stared at him for a long second. Did you suspect anything? Number. Did you know he hated Claire? Daniel closed his eyes. I knew he was cruel, he whispered. I kept telling myself he was just old-fashioned, difficult, proud. His voice cracked. I should have protected you from him before tonight. Emma looked at me. There was no anger in her eyes, only pain, confusion, exhaustion, and something else. Recognition. As if for the first time she understood that I had spent years standing between her and storms she never even saw. Richard tried to regain control then because men like him do not know how to exist without control. This is family business, he barked. Everyone leave. But nobody moved quickly. Not anymore. His voice had lost its power. Daniel turned toward him slowly. No, Dad. This stopped being family business when soldiers died. Richard's mouth tightened. You don't understand what government contracts are like. Mistakes happen. War is messy. I watched Daniel flinch at that. War is messy. The phrase sounded almost obscene beneath the wedding lights. I thought of Sergeant Torres, of the folded flag mailed to his widow, of young men writing letters home from desert bases believing the people supplying their equipment valued their lives more than profit margins. Daniel removed his wedding boutonniere with shaking fingers and dropped it onto a nearby table. I'm done defending you, he said. Richard stared at his son like he had been slapped. Emma quietly took Daniel's hand. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a choice. And sometimes that is where healing begins. My father appeared beside me a few minutes later, holding his whiskey glass like a shield. Claire, he said quietly, I think we should talk. I looked at him. Really looked. At the man whose absence shaped my entire adult life. The man who left my mother to die without dignity, who let me become a parent before I was old enough to fully become myself, who stood silent while another man called me a failure. What do you want to talk about? I asked. He swallowed. I know I wasn't perfect. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was so small. So cowardly. Not perfect. As if abandonment was a flaw like being late to dinner. You weren't imperfect, I said. You were gone. His face twitched. Melissa stood several feet behind him, suddenly very interested in the carpet. I was young, he said. You were 43. I was unhappy. So was Mom, I replied. She stayed. That landed. For once he had no easy answer. He looked toward Emma, then back at me. I want to make things right. You had chances. Claire, no. My voice stayed calm, but something old and tired rose beneath it. When Mom got sick, you had a chance. When Emma cried herself to sleep, you had a chance. When I mailed you graduation photos, school bills, medical forms, every document you should have helped sign, you had chances. His eyes reddened, but I did not soften. Some tears come too late to be useful. And tonight I added, when that man humiliated me in front of everyone, you had one final chance. He looked down. You said nothing. The words sat between us like a closed door. Then I walked away. Not angry, not victorious, free. Outside, the night air was cooler than I expected. The harbor lights shimmered in the distance, scattered across the black water like broken glass. I stood on the terrace alone, breathing slowly, letting the noise behind me fade. A few minutes later, Emma joined me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder just like she used to when she was little. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? For needing so much from you. I turned toward her immediately. Emma, no. I didn't know, she said, crying now. I knew you gave up things, but I didn't know how much of yourself you buried just so I could feel safe. The wind moved softly through her veil. I touched the side of her face. I made Mom a promise. I know, and I'd make it again. She broke then, folding into me with the same small sound she made the night our mother died. I held her tightly, one arm around her shoulders, my chin resting against her hair. You were never the shame of this family, she whispered. I closed my eyes. You were the only reason I still believed I had one. That nearly undid me. Later, Emma and Daniel decided not to continue the reception. There would be no more speeches, no first dance beneath chandeliers, no staged photographs with people who cared more about image than love. A week later, they married quietly in Emma's backyard. 20 people came. Her students made paper flowers. Her elderly neighbor baked lemon bars. Daniel wore a simple navy suit. Emma wore the same dress, but no veil this time. And I walked her down the aisle. Not our father. Me. At the end, she squeezed my arm and whispered, "Love you bigger than the sky." For the first time in years, my voice shook when I answered. Always bigger. Before leaving that evening, I stood beside a small framed photograph of our mother on the porch table. Her smile was soft, tired, beautiful. I touched 2 fingers to the frame. I kept my promise, I whispered. And maybe that was the real revenge. Not destroying Richard Whitmore. Not exposing my father's cowardice. But standing there after all those years watching the girl I raised build a life no one could take from her. Because some people share your blood and still never become family. And some people spend their whole lives holding the roof up, never asking anyone to notice. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you believe family is made by blood loyalty or sacrifice. We have many more stories like this to share every day, so subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Thank you for listening.